Hello, this is Mr. Weber again, and you are watching video lecture number 47. Today we are talking about moving towards total war. A couple sections we're going to cover today. The first is mobilizing armies and civilians, and the second is mobilizing resources. So, the beginnings of the Civil War didn't go the way that either side had planned. Initially, like many other wars in history, both sides felt that it was going to be a short, quick, decisive victory. Neither side really understood how long and how devastating this war would become. It ends up becoming a total war. Now, a total war is something in which it's a type of conflict in which all of the resources of a nation are used in winning a war. That's one side of it. Another side of total war is that civilians, private property, non-combatants, all of these things are considered fair targets for the war. Ulysses S. Grant remarked after Shiloh that complete conquest was the only way that the Union would win. And in some degree he was right. So what we have here in this section is a movement, a shift in the idea that we are now fighting for survival. Definitely in the South, they're not only defending their way of life, but they're defending everything about their lives, their properties, their families, not just their economy, not just their slaves. So, we are looking at moving towards total war, and let's go ahead and get started by looking at that very first section, mobilizing armies and civilians. So again, the military carnage of 1862 forced both sides into total war, utilizing all of the resources of both nations to win at all costs. After the defeat at Shiloh in 1862, the Confederate Congress imposed the first legally binding draft in American history. The Confederate Draft had two loopholes. It exempted one white man for each 20 slaves on a plantation, and it allowed drafted men to hire substitutes. Some Southerners refused to serve, and the Confederate government lacked the power to compel them. The Confederate Congress overrode state judges' orders to free conscripted men. To prevent sabotage and concerted resistance to the war efforts in the Union, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and imprisoned about 15,000 Confederate sympathizers without trial. He also extended martial law to civilians who discouraged enlistment or resisted the draft. The Union government's Militia Act of 1862 set a quota of volunteers for each state, which was increased by the Enrollment Act of 1863. Northerners, too, could hire replacements. Hostility to the Enrollment Act of 1863 draft and to African Americans spilled into the streets of New York City when Irish and German workers sacked the homes of Republicans, killed a dozen African Americans, and forced hundreds of black families from their homes. Lincoln rushed in Union troops to suppress the insurrection in New York. The Union Army Medical Bureau and the United States Sanitary Commission provided medical services to the soldiers and tried to prevent deaths from disease, which killed more men than did the fighting. The Confederate health system was poorly organized, and soldiers died from camp diseases at a higher rate than Union soldiers. Now, women took a leading role in the Sanitary Commission and other wartime agencies. Dorothea Dix was the first woman to receive a major federal appointment. Women staffed growing bureaucracies, volunteered to serve as nurses, and filled positions traditionally held by men. And this is a pattern that does repeat itself in American wartime history. A number of women took on military duties as well. They were spies, they were scouts disguised as men, and they were also soldiers disguised as men. All right, the next section, mobilizing resources. The The Union entered the war with an advantage. Its economy was far superior, and its arms factories were equipped for mass production. The Confederates had substantial industrial capacity, and by 1863, they were able to provide every infantryman with a modern rifled musket. Confederate leaders counted on King Cotton to provide revenue to purchase clothes, boots, blankets, and weapons from abroad. Now, the British government never recognized the independence of the Confederacy, but it did recognize the rebel government as a belligerent power with the right under international law to borrow money and purchase weapons. To sustain the allegiance of Northerners to their party while bolstering the Union's ability to fight the war, the Republicans raised tariffs. They also created a national banking system. They devised a system of internal improvements, especially railroads, and they developed the Homestead Act of 1862. Henry Clay would have really liked that stuff, huh? The Confederate government's economic policy was less coherent. The Davis administration built and operated shipyards, armories, foundries, and textile mills, commandeered food and raw materials, and requisitioned slaves to work on forts. The Union government created a modern nation state that raised revenue for the war by imposing broad-based taxes, borrowing from the middle class, and creating a national monetary system that was based on the Legal Tender Act of 1862, which authored the issue of $150 million in Treasury notes, soon to be known as greenbacks. The Confederacy lacked a central government. It financed about 60% of its expenses with unbacked paper money, which created inflation. Citizens' property rights were violated then in order to sustain the war. All right, so that concludes this video lecture today. Short and sweet, but it does give us an introduction to the methods by which each side would finance the war and would conduct the war. Okay, so at this time, please answer the review questions at the bottom of the screen and continue on with your notes.